I think you heard from the administration and the State Department yesterday that there was a little bit of progress made, but we're still very far apart on some issues.
There is no room for negotiations. Saying we must definitely reach this certain agreement, that is foolish.
President Trump has been pretty clear-eyed about this and communicated that to the Iranians, and we'll see if they are willing to make a deal. But President Trump holds all the cards right now in this situation.
A lot of talk about negotiations, but a lot of movement of U.S. military assets into the Middle East. The headlines on the possible war with Iran. Times of Israel, U.S.-Iran war could be imminent, take weeks. Wall Street Journal, Iran is getting ready for war with the U.S. Axios, Trump moves closer to a major war with Iran. On Axios, it says that a U.S. military operation in Iran would likely be a massive weeks-long campaign that would look more like full-fledged war than last month's pinpoint operation in Venezuela, sources say. Sources noted it would likely be a joint U.S.-Israeli campaign that's much broader in scope and more existential for the regime than the Israeli-led 12-day war last June, which the U.S. eventually joined. Let's start there with the panel. Fox News contributor Ben Domenech, host of the Big Ben podcast, Fox News radio political analyst Josh Kraushaar, and Leslie Marshall, Fox News contributor. Ben, we keep on getting these headlines. Our reporting suggests that, there is not a lot of hope on these negotiations, but the president, every time he talks about it, says there is still time for Iran to turn around.
Well, I think that there's a lot of hope going on there, hopium potentially, when it comes to the interactions that we have with the regime. They seem to be very dug in, at least according to the experts that I speak to. And I think that the fact that we've got virtually a third of the U.S. Navy, either already there or gunning their way, is an indication of how close we are to something very significant happening here. My concern for the administration, as it has been for a while now, is that I'm not sure that the president has done the work, and his allies within the world and within this perspective on Iran have done the work to convince the American people that this is something that is in their interest. Indeed, that's what polling indicates. And I think that that's going to be a very risky thing for him to do, given the unique nature of the coalition he built, which was not in small part built on opposition to Middle East wars.
That's a fair point. I mean, where there hasn't been a major speech about Iran, obviously he's coming up on the State of the Union address. And U.S. Senator Mark Warner on the Intel Committee said there are disagreements in Europe that's causing more problems. Take a listen.
Our ability to really put pressure on the regime, and the regime is awful, is really going to be undercut by the fact that our Europeans who have diplomatic relations with Iran, I'm not sure they're going to be fully there because of their uncertainty about the president's overall foreign policy approach. The idea that that he is going to launch a war with just Israel at our side is not in the best interest of the United States at this point.
Leslie.
Well, in addition to Senator Warner taking my talking points there, because it's not in the best interest of the American people. We're not looking at 12 days like we saw with Israel and Iran. And when we look at just what happened with the strikes in 2025, we look at hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are going to be hurt. You have to look at the casualties, and that's human life. Now let's look at a different cost, economics, right? We haven't had the Strait of Hormuz shut since 1980. And so everybody says, look, this looks like imminent war, not just a few weeks, especially if it's just the United States and Israel. The additional problem is, the cost economically to the world. We have to look at how much oil does Iran supply. And then when you look at the regime change, that doesn't necessarily happen even if we go forward with this. And that's a huge risk.
So Reuters satellite images show Iran repairing and fortifying sites amid U.S. tensions, showing that Iran recently built a concrete shield over a new facility at a sensitive military site covered in soil. Advanced work at a location reportedly bombed by Israel in 2024. Essentially, they're doing work. And as you look at the U.S. naval assets to Iran, supporters of this action, Josh, say the Iranian regime has never been this weak, and they've never been at this state. And that is the impetus for what they believe is a possible regime change move.
They've never been this weak. They've also never been this extreme. I mean, you would think that they would come to the bargaining table, make concessions over their nuclear development. Ballistic missiles is a big ask for the White House for them to give up the production of missiles. They don't seem to be offering much of anything other than public relations, and that's what's frustrating the White House. I think President Trump would love to cut some kind of deal, as he has with other American enemies or rivals, but the Iranians really haven't given an inch. And I think the White House, to Ben's point, would be well served to kind of declare whether the motivation is in response to Iranian buildup of nuclear development, in response to the ballistic missiles, or in response to what he originally posted after their regime massacred tens of thousands of their own civilians, where the president said, help is on the way. That was what it kind of raised the stakes in terms of the military action.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to hear some of this in the State of the Union address, but everything that's being previewed by the administration and the president himself is about the U.S. economy. Take a listen.
People are going to see and watch the State of the Union. We're going to be talking about the economy. We have energy way down. Gasoline is now breaking $2 a gallon in many places.
Meanwhile, the president is making life harder and less affordable with tariff taxes on working families and small businesses, imposing increased bureaucracy on states, lower job creation than any year since Trump's first term.
A slimming down governor of Illinois saying that they're going to fight on the economy.
Rested and ready to serve. I think that one of the things that we're going to hear from the president obviously is going to be taking a victory lap on things that the White House feels he has been underappreciated for. We heard some of that from Caroline Leavitt today. But I also think that it's very important for him to reset expectations that relates to domestic affairs, and particularly the fact that people, I believe, who have been drifting away from his coalition, who voted for him most recently, feel that he is focused so much on the world as opposed to local things, as opposed to what's happening here at home. I don't think that that's always a fair suggestion, but I do think that it's one that the president needs to battle, and he should lean into that.
Some of the messaging, and we talked about this with Britt, that there's this get-together with cabinet members, the White House Chief of Staff, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, talking about messaging. Some of that, Leslie, is going to be, do you want to hand the baton back to the people who gave you the highest inflation in decades, the last administration? And they're saying, give us some time. And you've heard that. You've made that argument when we were back at Bidenomics. And can that message sail?
I don't think it's going to sail now, and the reason is, one, you can't stand there and say we're stronger in the midst of a government shutdown. You can't say we're stronger when you have 15,000 less farms.
Although I would say the Democrats might be responsible for the government shutdown and not the administration.
Not from my viewpoint as a Democrat.
As Jesse Helms once said, every day these buildings are closed, the republic grows stronger.
The party in charge is the party responsible, whether credit or blame. You have companies like Amazon, you have UPS and the Washington Post, and the list goes on, thousands of people being laid off. You have, again, and I've said this during the Biden administration, it's what people feel. And they can look at what the NASDAQ says, they can look at inflation. And it's not just about gas prices. It's about kitchen table issue and kitchen table cost. And they don't feel that those costs are coming down. They don't feel that life is affordable. There is the question of tariffs, how those are hurting businesses, especially small businesses, and that cost is passed on to the consumer. So, no, I don't think it's going to be a message that's going to be well received.
There is optimism about the numbers heading in the right direction, Josh, when you talk to not only the economists in the administration, but others. But you're starting to get to when you get to the middle of the year, that's where the political cake is baked. Yeah. And they start running out of time if you look at the numbers.
The perception is reality, and the perception right now of the economy isn't great despite really good macroeconomic indicators. The Dow, as the president likes to remind us, has been right around 50,000. The stock market has been in good shape. The one thing I think the White House would be well served to talk more about, I didn't hear it come out of the reports from the meeting near Capitol Hill last night, but the housing, the younger voters that voted for Trump, that defected from the Democrats, from Biden because of the economy. A lot of it is trying to have the money to buy a first-time home buyers. A lot of people trying to enter the home market for the first time. Those are the voters that are swinging back to the Democrats for the midterms. And it's not tangential issues. It's the heart of how you start your economic future, and that's something that Trump could be well advised to talk more about.
I want to get into the story that really stinks, and that is the Potomac River. This is the D.C. Water CEO responding to the president's Truth Social about this.
As to the tweet, as far as I'm seeing it right now, We have not, at this point in time, sat down with EPA and said, we need this much money. If they think that we can do something differently, we would love to hear that. Right now, they have said you're doing everything the correct way.
There has been no improvement under the leadership of Governor Moore. He's clearly shown he's incapable of fixing this problem, which is why President Trump and the federal government are standing by to step in.
David Gaddis, the CEO, was a consultant for Flint, Michigan's water system.
Yeah, that's an interesting hiring choice,
they
you'd
had
think.
their own
Look, I have to say, this is a local story that actually I think should have more legs nationally than it currently does. We are talking about one of the biggest spills, if not the biggest spill in American history. We have not seen the kind of coverage that this deserves to receive. And a lot of this, I happen to think, is because of the partisanship involved here. There is not a single official responsible for this who is not someone who Democrats have elected or supported. And I think that the simple fact of the matter is they need to be solving this problem as quickly as possible. Wes Moore likes to talk about getting stuff done. Get this done. Get the Francis Scott Key Bridge done. Stop delaying. Stop, hemming and hawing, and stop blaming other people for your problems. Either deal with it or call for help.
Remember the oil spill in the Gulf? It was all about get it done, stop it. And I think that's where we are.
Well, I would have to say, when you say get it done, it is not the state of Maryland or the governor of Maryland's job to do it. This falls under federal jurisdiction.
That is not true.
Do not say that. This falls under federal jurisdiction.
It falls under D.C. Water and Sewer
also
and
the
Maryland.
EPA, which, by the way, no one from the EPA went
true.
to any of the legislative hearings about this and how to repair this. So this doesn't need to be,
that is
oh,
not
is
a
it
true
federal
talking
or is
point,
it
Leslie.
state? The president's calling in FEMA a federal organization, which,
All right.
by the way, I believe Republicans wanted to get rid of.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We will fight this again.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.